Hi everyone. This short video is going to walk you through the steps for how to read a story for this course. What we want to remember is that reading assignments for English 1020 are meant to be analytical assignments, not necessarily just for pleasure. So there's a few steps that we want to kind of think about as we approach these stories so that we can get something from the other end. So the first step for reading the story is obviously just to read the story. But unlike maybe reading a magazine or the internet, we have to kind of take the time to read in a slow and thoughtful manner. So the first thing that you should do is read always with a pen or pencil or highlighter or something in your hand to mark on the story. If you don't like to mark on your books, then you're going to need to take notes separately. Now, the first time that you go through the story, you should be judicious in your marking, but you should also kind of make a note of anything that strikes you. So the first time you read a story, you really are just reading for pleasure. But even then, certain things are going to stand out to you. So any words that stand out, words you don't understand, if you hit a phrase or a sentence or a passage that seems like an odd way to describe an event or something that's happening, you should probably make a little mark so you can come back to that. You should also note if there are any phrases or ideas or events that are repeated in the story. Those are probably going to indicate symbolism later. Any repetition in general, you should kind of make a note of so you can track it throughout the story. And then finally, the thing that you really need to mark are things you don't understand. Oftentimes when you're reading interpretive fiction, the first time through is a bit confusing. So just marking those passages where you get a little bit lost can often help you figure out the kind of key to understanding the story. Now, your first read through is really for the formal features, and that just means you're reading to find out what happens. So you're reading for plot, setting, character, and point of view, or narrator. Plot, what action occurs in the story? So basically you're reading to figure out what happens. Setting, where and when is this story set? So what context clues does the story give you so that you can figure out where we are in time and place? Character, so who are the characters? You should have a notebook ready to kind of make a list of their names and features. And then finally, you want to pay attention to the point of view or the narrator. So stories are either told in first person, that's the I'm telling you this story, or the third person, he, she, they did something. If it's third person, you're going to want to find out, is this omniscient? Does the narrator know everything about the story? Or are there certain things the narrator doesn't know? And then, is the narrator trustworthy? Do they seem to be telling the truth? So once you've gone through the story the first time, the next thing that you need to do is reread the story. Like I said, this is not a book club, so all stories and poems for our course should be read at least twice. The first reading's for pleasure, where you're just kind of enjoying the experience or not enjoying it sometimes, but you're really going to be paying attention to your own reactions to how the story progresses. The second reading, however, is for analysis, and if you don't get to the second reading, it's going to be really difficult to answer any of the questions or write any of the papers for this course. So in the second reading, you're looking at how the text is built. So what you want to kind of remember is that these stories were all constructed carefully for a purpose, to give the reader a certain effect. So paying attention to the choices an author makes can really help. You want to ask yourself, why might the author have made the choices he or she made? And what effect do those choices have on the story? So let's walk through a few things so you can kind of see what I mean by that. So the second reading is really to examine how the parts of the story fit into the whole of the story. You're still going to be looking at those formal elements, plot, setting, character, and point of view, but you're also going to be looking at stylistic elements, images, symbols, and figurative language. So in terms of plot, you want to ask yourself, are the events of the story told from beginning to end? In traditional stories, it starts with once upon a time and ends up at the end of the story. However, sometimes there are flashbacks in a story. Sometimes there are flash forwards or foreshadowing. And some of the stories we read will actually be told out of order. So paying attention to just how the plot is revealed to you can be important. Character. Who is your protagonist? Remember, the protagonist is the character you know the most about, the main character. You don't necessarily have to like them, and they don't necessarily have to be the best person in the story. The antagonist is the person or the thing that is actively working against the protagonist. So the other thing that you want to pay attention to is how do the other characters relate to the protagonist? Which characters get names, for instance? Which characters get to be described? Are any of the other characters acting as foils to the protagonist? Setting. What do you need to know about the time period to know what's going on? We're going to be talking first about Story of an Hour. So what do you need to know about the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the way marriage worked at that time? The other thing you want to ask is, why does the story need to be set in this time and place? The obvious answer might be because that's when the author lived. But a less obvious answer might have to do with something in the story, some social issue that the author is making a comment on. Character. Oh wait, we're on point of view. So why does point of view and narrator, why does the story need the narrator it has? So if you think about a story narrated first person through third person, first person has certain limitations, third person has certain limitations. What do we gain or miss in the story because of the narrator the author has chosen? Then you want to think about stylistic images. So remember, images are any sensory detail. So any of the five senses, not just visual. But you want to kind of think about what sensory descriptions are included in the story and how do they or what do they add to the story's tone. Then symbols. Are any of the images repeated, or do any images seem to have a larger significance? Remember, symbols always have to be the thing itself plus the thing it's representing. So if you think something might be a symbol, you'll want to have to figure out the argument for what it's a symbol for. And then finally, figurative language. Look for similes and metaphors, those comparisons that an author might make to things that are recognizable. How do they impact the tone of the story? Do they make it happier, darker, funnier? Why might the author have done that? So your goal in reading literature is to make an argument for the meaning of the story. Step 3 is to analyze, and you can't get to step 3 until you've done step 1 and step 2. But once you have, you can kind of start putting together those pieces and figuring out what you think. So remember, meaning is not the same thing as topic. Meaning is always an argument, which means it's always going to be a complete sentence and supportable by evidence. Meaning comes not from some magical book that English professors have, but from the reader's thoughtful and critical experience with the text itself. And remember, meaning has to be supported by evidence from the text. So, after viewing this video, I want you to take a few moments to either read, if you haven't already, or reread The Story of an Hour. Be sure that you're annotating the story, marking those passages that you find interesting, strange, or frustrating. And on your rereading, I want you to make notes about those formal and stylistic aspects of the text. When you're done, then it's time to move on to the next video when we'll talk a little bit more about Story of an Hour.